of international experts and local experts on a topic which is going to be increasingly important, I think, in an era where we have that much more volatility in international relations. Let me very briefly introduce our panel, and then we'll start one by one. First to speak will be David Miller, the director of the C40 Climate Leadership Group and the former mayor of Toronto, amongst many other important roles. And I look forward to hearing from David. Then we'll be followed by Alice Charles, who's the project lead of cities at the World Economic Forum, of course, one of the great convening points of the world. Followed by Mr. Sergey Cheremin, the Minister of the Moscow government, head of the Department for Foreign, Economic and International Relations. And then John Young, who's the chairman and co-founder of the Intelligent Community Forum, a group of over, I believe, 130 cities. 170 cities around the world working together on to create a better world. And finally, Fyodor Lukyanov, the editor-in-chief of Russia in Global Affairs, providing a view on how global cities are becoming the guardians of globalization. So we have a tight and compact session, which we I think will make full use of. And to start it off, we've posed this I've posed this challenge to the group, which is essentially to say where and how will cities replace states in international affairs? Will cities replace states, and how will they do so? So that's the topic, and I hope that I'm sure we will have robust debate. I hope we will leave a few minutes for the audience to have questions as well. So please do prepare yourself for that. But with that, I'm now going to hand it to David to start by giving a bit of the background and the context from your perspective.
Thanks very much, Jonathan, for the question, and thank you to the organizers for having me here today. I thought I'd speak a little bit in this context about the C40 as an organization and a couple of areas that it's been involved in as an example of an answer to the question. But the question is, will cities supplant national governments as instruments of international diplomacy? And I first have to give my answer to that because Jonathan phrased the question, when? And my answer is, they already have. In very important ways on the issues that matter the most globally. And I'm going to speak about climate, but it's true on immigration, it's true on economics, it's true on other issues. Cities are already acting as international diplomats without waiting for the permission of their national governments. And it's a really fascinating and interesting time for the world because about 9 years ago, for the first time ever, more people in the world lived in urban areas than lived in rural areas. So from the beginning of time until about 2008, 2009, the world was predominantly rural. Now it's predominantly urban. And one of the consequences of that is that mayors have assumed a leadership role in the world that is unprecedented for 400 or 500 years. And for me, that role is only going to increase, and I'll be very interested to hear the comments of our colleagues. And to explain my perspective, I need to speak a little bit about the organization that I work for, the C40 Group of Cities, which is about 96 of the world's leading megacities, cities over 3 million people. And the C40's formal name is the C40 Climate Leadership Group. These cities came together to work on the issue of climate change, not through the United Nations, not through the Conference of the Parties process under the Kyoto Accord, but together as cities. We didn't need all the cities. We chose the largest, including Moscow, who's making a very important contribution, in order to succeed on this issue while national governments weren't. And unfortunately, my slides aren't clicking, but it doesn't really matter for the point of my remarks. In Copenhagen, in the COP15 in 2009, as you may recall if you follow climate action closely, the national governments at that time were unable to reach agreement on strategies and obligations to overcome climate change. In fact, they couldn't reach agreement until 6 years later at COP21 in Paris. But at the same time, the cities held their own climate summit in front of City Hall in Copenhagen to demonstrate real actions that were happening at that time on climate change through international cooperation of cities, through leadership and sharing of best practices. The C40 today, with 96 cities, represents over 700 million people, about 25% of the world's economy. And if you look at all urban areas, about 75% of greenhouse gases come from those urban areas. And we know that by acting in transportation, buildings, waste management, and electricity generation, you can make better cities and dramatically lower greenhouse gases. And why do we know that? Because in Copenhagen, the cities said, while nations talk, cities act, and they demonstrated their actions to the world. Extremely significant moments, and in some ways I think the city actions led to national governments, great, fantastic, being embarrassed and finally acting in Paris. More recent examples in the United States of America, and it's part of my role in the C40 to support North American mayors in their climate work. And we know that the United States of America, under their current administration, has declared that they're going to leave the Paris Accord. Now let's remember, it took national governments 21 years to agree on Paris. The only country in the world who has decided, or at least announced, that it's not going to honor its obligations is the United States. And what did mayors do? They said, we're still in. As we heard from President Calderon, hundreds of US mayors have said, we're still in. Now, they're not formally signatories to Paris. They didn't have to go through the UN process of debating every word, but it doesn't matter. They're effectively implementing the Paris Agreement in the United States today, regardless of the position of the administration. And to me, this is quite demonstrative of the potential role of cities in international affairs. These are the C40 cities, as you can see. They span the world, equal number in the developing world and the developed. As I said, Moscow's an important member. And why are they focused on climate? Because they have to. Cities are seeing flooding, they're seeing storms, they're having huge impacts. Even cities like Houston, the home of the United States part of the global oil industry, are looking at greenhouse gas emissions seriously because of the impact of the hurricanes they've had. So mayors have to act, and they're using that power and to work internationally and collaboratively to overcome these challenges. And this is a photograph from the C40, and you can see mayors globally, and this is US mayors, who are saying that we will act. And if you apply this model, the C40 is a group organized around climate. But similar organizations could exist to address migration issues. People migrate to cities. Notationally, they migrate to countries because that's where they get their papers from, but they actually go to live in cities. The same with economic issues, social issues, other issues. And that's why I say cities already are acting as international diplomats. They're not waiting for permission. They're taking the actions collaboratively, globally, and we will only see that increase. And thanks, Jonathan. That's my first intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. So, cities are already acting. Alice, do you see that as well? Are they delegates to the WEF? What is happening in Geneva?
Thank you very much for having me here today. I first want to answer your question that you put to us earlier, which was around the role of the city versus the nation state. So from my perspective, I believe that the two need to work very closely together if we're going to get the transformation of cities. So why are cities important? So as was previously mentioned, we have 54% of the world's population living in cities today, and the UN estimates that by 2050 we will have 68% living in cities. We have 1.5 million people moving to cities every single week. And as was outlined by our previous speaker, that, for example, in the case of the Paris Accord, you still have the US cities still in. But it's not just in relation to climate. Currently, the United Nations is preparing the Global Compact on migration, and again, the United States has decided to pull out of the negotiation of that agreement, but cities are still in. So in the US, cities are gathering together and working with international cities to work on this issue of migration and to make sure that in the negotiations, it's recognized the impact that migration can have on cities and the solutions that they're employing. So I guess in the absence of a formal way for cities to engage in international agreements, you're seeing this rapid expansion of mayoral networks. And I'll come on to it a little bit later, but one of the things that we're also seeing is that the G20 is now creating a space for urban leaders to interact. So we don't have a formal place for city leaders at the table in the UN process or the World Bank process, but we do have these mayoral networks such as C40, ICLAI, UCLG, Metropolis, the Global Parliament of Mayors, the Global Covenant of Mayors, OECD Champion Mayors, Strong Cities Network, etc. And of course there's more regional networks that exist for mayors as well. So cities are finding their way to find their voice. They're finding an opportunity to exchange in terms of their challenges and exchange in terms of their solutions. Of course, solutions have to be contextualized, but if they're able to share best practice, they're better able to employ it in their city. In terms of transforming our cities, there are political and regulatory barriers at the national level that are preventing the transformation of cities. So, in my view, the national government needs to clearly work with city government if they're going to get transformation. If they want to get progress on some of these issues that I've highlighted, such as climate change, environmental degradation, issues around aging populations in cities, increasing polarization in cities, migration, terrorism, the fourth industrial revolution, food security, then cities and national government need to be working very closely together. Some countries have recognized the value, for example, of foreign affairs ministries as a natural channel of capital-to-capital policy in relation to urbanism. The previous US administration set up a cities team in the US State Department, and that was with the view to, for example, negotiating the new urban agenda, that the national government was very connected to the city level governments, so they understood what they were negotiating and the position of the cities within their country. But it also allowed this international exchange in terms of urban policy. We're also seeing the same in Singapore. For example, the Smart Nation project is very much contained within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And they see themselves having a future role in consulting with other cities around the world and helping them to transition to a smart and sustainable future. And they're already doing that with cities like Tianjin in China, for example, in the Eco-City, and they're also working with the new capital city that's being developed in the state of Andhra Pradesh in India. And more recently, we're now seeing the G20 reaching out and realizing that there's this opportunity for G20 leaders to bring in city leaders to start to exchange on urbanism. So what do we do at the World Economic Forum? So the World Economic Forum is an international organization that enables public-private cooperation. And in that sense, what we aim to do is by convening to improve the state of the world. And in the context of cities, what we're seeking to do is improve the state of the world. We convene leaders of government, of business, of civil society, young leaders, for example, and we bring them together to discuss the challenges that they're facing and try and work together to form major solutions. In the context of cities, we very much do that. I suppose the big things we're also focused on is we recognize that there's so many mayoral networks, there's so many international organizations that are all trying to get traction in the area of cities. So what we're seeking to do is not just do the core work that we're doing in the World Economic Forum, but to open up our platform to allow others to come in with their projects and their ideas to ensure that we're getting radical transformation and we're not replicating each other's efforts, but indeed supporting each other's efforts. So Areas that there's greater public-private collaboration required in is everything from, first of all, believe it or not, there is no single definition in relation to what constitutes urban. So the data that the United Nations gathers for member states around the world that allows them to estimate what the future population will be is based on the individual definition of many member states. And they say 68% of the population will be urban by 2050, but the European Commission has just said, actually, they believe it will be 84%. And they're basing that on satellite data that they've been able to analyse. So I think it's important that we get the actors around the table to first define what is urban so you can start to plan for a proper future. Also, we need some standards around city data. So, for example, there's no uniform standard for cities to gather data, but another piece is the private sector and indeed citizens have a lot of data. So it's not just the data that's within City Hall, but it's the data that they can prosume from citizens and from corporates that could help cities make better informed decisions. So there's definitely work to be done there. Also, in relation to governance and finance, what is happening in many parts of the world is the proliferation of pilot smart city projects. But these projects are not getting to scale. And we're seeing that 75% of these projects are dying at the pilot stage. And this is happening because of issues with governance, issues with regulation, and also a lack of finance. Either cities are indebted, they're influenced by the sovereign credit rating, for example. They're not able to increase taxes within their cities. They're not able to easily enter into public-private partnerships because they don't have the capacity within their local authority. So these are all issues that are preventing radical transformation and require greater public-private collaboration. So that's all I'm going to say.
So thank you. So I hear, from David that we are going to see that cities are already doing it, and from Alice that cities are now working together with states, but there are still some barriers. There's information, there's finance, there's coordination. So perhaps, Mr. Cheremin, you could share with us where Moscow stands on this and how Moscow sees the development of Moscow's own international relations.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad to welcome all of you here at this session. And let me tell you what Russia does or is doing as it develops its relations with major metropolises of the world, major economic regions of the world. Of course, Moscow is not a country, is not a state, even though we are a separate entity, a separate region in the Russian Federation. It makes us be more active in the international activities. In the last years, we had unprecedented international ties and activities. We work with more than 100 major metropolises of the world, and for us it's important that there is this real exchange of practices, best global innovative practices for managing our cities. We actively support a positive business climate. We implement some of the best practices and solutions. Last week, I visited Singapore at the Mayor's Summit, and I'm thankful to the organizers of C40 who nominated Moscow for Lee Kuan Yew award. Unfortunately, we did not get it. We lost to Seoul. We will try to win it next year. But as I attended the Singapore forum, as I spoke with colleagues from different countries, I felt that it was truly an international forum where some very important decisions were made impacting lives of hundreds of millions or even billions of people. I'm not going to mention numbers that have already been mentioned here at the forum, how many people live in metropolises of the world, how many residents of the cities we will have by 2050. The numbers are huge, and of course, sovereign states cannot be too careless about recommendations and wishes of major metropolises, major cities of the world. You cannot ignore them due to their economic importance. If you look at Moscow, for example, we often compare economic potential of just one capital of the Russian Federation with average European countries such as Austria, Czech Republic, or Finland. We often interact not just with capitals of other countries or major economic regions such as Northern Rhine-Westphalia or Bavaria. We also organize our own intergovernmental commissions. We have had this good practice of such interaction with Israel, with Finland, with the Czech Republic. We are not trying to substitute federal level commissions where they discuss global issues, but we are a very efficient tool for cooperation and experience exchange in economics and urbanism and in developing transportation and education and environment and healthcare and culture. Actually, we repeat the Hanseatic model of Hansa that existed hundreds of years ago when cities had that half-sovereign functions, when there were no clear borders between European states. And what is happening today, how the city acts as a driver of economic policy and is part of international cooperation, I think this trend will continue. And this is what our practice has shown here in Moscow. Today, partners of the Russian capital are everywhere, starting from the Far East and the countries of Southeast Asia and all the way to the US or Latin South America. We have this active interaction in terms of the number of events. We're way above, or we can be compared with the events at the federal level. What does it give to Moscow? First of all, it's an opportunity to preserve competitiveness, because as a sponge we are trying to absorb all cutting-edge technologies, all innovative solutions. And we are really thankful to such partners as Singapore, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Beijing, Berlin, Paris, even New York, Houston, Lima, Mexico City. And in every region we find something new, and we are trying to, at the same time, to show that Moscow is one of the most actively growing metropolises, not just in Eastern Europe, but one of the most interesting markets for doing business in Europe, because the projects that Moscow presented at this urban forum that Mayor of Moscow presented, they are of huge size, and in terms of the number of metro lines that we're building, new metro stations and roads, parks, we can be compared with some of the best cities of the world. This opinion exchange at the Urban Forum is in reality an exchange of opinions between countries, because we are all in one boat, in one environment, and we have similar challenges that we face. That's why cities often act as trendsetters to promote those laws at the federal level that we need. And Moscow does it actively, and many federal initiatives start at the level of Moscow. this cooperation between major cities will continue and be getting stronger, and as it happened in the U.S. when they even if the federal government wants to abandon climate agreements, they have to listen to the opinion of their metropolises. They cannot simply ignore them, otherwise they will lose stability in the country.
Cheremin, and for an inspiring vision of how Moscow is acting, if you will, as a tool, as a more efficient mechanism for national development. And I think it's a tribute to the capacity of the Moscow government that it's able to do that. Now, if I could turn to you, Mr. Young, to talk a bit about the Intelligent Communities Forum and how they are working together, and how intelligence is not just technology, but is actually in the fabric of the city.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure. Okay, we'll move forward here. We're looking at great disruptions in society these days, aren't we? We're looking at technical and digital disruptions. We're looking at things that are happening in other parts of the world where climate change is very important. We're looking at disruptions that are part of urbanization. Many cities are turning into megacities. And finally, we have issues around globalization. I'm not even going to go into the political disruptions that are out there, but all those disruptions are taking place, and people in cities are banding together and working through their leadership, their thought leadership, as well as their political leadership, to give a direction that maybe the federal governments aren't able to provide these days. So you saw some images from previous speakers where they are doing these things. They are taking climate change issues to the forefront. C40, of course, is a key player. And I'll just go to my own organization. The Intelligent Community Forum is headquartered in New York, but it has 170 organizations around the world that are communities. And communities are often described as cities, but they're really public-private partnerships of government, private sector, and the institutions that form a community. And we have 170 that we work with. And what we are looking for is ways in which those communities can work together to translate and transform opportunities, not only in their own communities, but to share solutions, ideas, and progress among a number of cities. So what we have is the beginnings of some of these cities working in corridors or triangles with other cities. So for instance, a place in Holland that was transformed when the Philips company left Eindhoven and created an economic development organization called Brainport. And Brainport became very successful in the transformation of their city and region. Well, that success was then shared with other regions in Aachen and Leuven in Belgium and so forth. And what happened was they took that success to other places, to Taiwan and to Vietnam. And they're sharing those successful stories and ways in which they have succeeded in Holland and are doing it in those places. We see this now happening in places like in Western China with the Western Chinese Economic Triangle, or in places in Ontario, for instance, where the Ontario Technology Corridor has created not only economic development opportunities among cities like Ottawa, Toronto, and Waterloo, but that idea birthed 13 cities coming together across Canada to work together to help their economic development and social progress. So consider Canada as that next model. That happens now in many other places, and you begin to see these economic corridors among not only national domestic cities, but you see it happening where they band together to help other countries. So for instance, we see Shanghai and Singapore working together, not only in their own communities, but now they're going to be in places like in Lagos, Nigeria. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. Here's an example of one of the communities in Vietnam, Binh Dong being assisted by the communities of Eindhoven and Holland. Of course, Shanghai and Singapore have been working together to create economic zones in places like Tianjin that Alice spoke about. but also developing it in their own countries. You have places now in Africa that are developing new smart communities, but they need help. So they're getting it from the Chinese, they're getting it from even companies. And so companies are beginning to become part of that important public-private partnership that is going to be becoming much more important as we move forward. And we're seeing it in competitions like Amazon's competition, where 238 cities responded to an Amazon headquarter proposal. I think we're going to not only look at cities, but we're going to have to start looking at the disruption of urban infrastructure by support of other cities, but also support by the private sector and by institutions as they come together. In Toronto, for instance, Google and many other US firms, Intersection and others, have come together and they're working on a project on the Toronto waterfront, which is now referred to as Sidewalk Toronto through Sidewalk Labs and Google's work. And we're beginning to see a partnership of not only cities, federal organizations, institutions, and the private sector. And I think we have to think in those terms as we move forward as well. Thank you.
John, so I hear you saying that, first of all, cities are increasingly stepping up, but a city is a broader concept. It's a community and it's a set of partnerships, and so we should recognize it's more complex than simply the public sector in and of itself. But with that, if I could turn to Fyodor. So in this era of complex international affairs, things are changing quite quickly. And globalization seems to be sometimes on the retreat, or people make different arguments. Where do you see cities in this? Are they guardians of globalization? Are they in the retreat?
Большое спасибо.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here and to make a speech. I'm not an expert on urban development, and that is why maybe I will be a little bit I will confront you a little bit. If we speak the issue about roles of cities, whether it's increased or not, of course, the answer will be yes, the role is increased. But the question which was put at the beginning by our moderator was quite tough. Can cities substitute the international countries in the international policy? And I think this is a different subject: interaction of large cities and expanding of their opportunities. Here we speak about international system. Answering your question. Will it substitute? No, it will not. But also we have a very interesting empirical experience. Will it substitute or not? When Great Britain finally finishes Brexit and will be in a new situation, and nobody now knows what situation it is. In this case, we'll see whether London will be a global city or not, because London is a symbol of globalization. Maybe London will push push away Great Britain, because London will have higher status than Great Britain has. Great Britain will be quite provincial because it even is not in Europe, but it can be also vice versa. If the state is out of some kind of system, it can also kill the city as well, because in bank sector, in London city, there are some fears that there can be, there will be money flowing out of London after Brexit. 10 years ago, a prominent economist, Daniel Roderick, formulated the paradox of globalization. So in global world, the states cannot mix three elements at the same time: sovereignty, democracy, and involvement in global economy. It was an argument for each other, because not everybody agrees. But this triangle also describes dilemmas which we have. When Daniel Roderick spoke about this idea, he meant that in this need to sacrifice something else, maybe sovereignty will be a victim, because global environment erases sovereign borders. Globalization will be here and democracy will be here, but sovereignty will go away. And these global cities which we discuss, not all cities, but metropolises. These cities are guardians of this globalization, and they would choose a refusal from sovereignty, because you know, for them it's not okay. But at the international arena it is different. 10 years passed and we can see that we can refuse, but not only from sovereignty. The ideas that sovereignty, identity, and something traditional, national, this is coming back, and these are trends. And it's interesting that the main government of the world, which is so powerful, which defines a lot in the world policy, so this is the state in this triangle, chooses what it can refuse from or not. It chooses globalization. It wants to refuse from globalization. America cannot refuse from democracy, because democracy is the main pillar. Sovereignty, it's of course also very important. It will always be in America, but they can refuse from globalization, and they can start building economy and policy in accordance with the principle America first. And the person does it who is from New York. New York is very cosmopolitan, and the product of this gigantic economy. And these people can make a conclusion that globalization for them is not so beneficial as they said earlier it to be. Secondly, which is extremely important, as I think, for development of big cities and metropolises, and this also can be reflected is reflected in these contradictions which we can see in the world. This is a gap between upper layer of the community from the other layers. Statistics always confirm this, that large cities or practically everywhere vote, and they are different from other country, from the rest of the country. So big cities are different from the rest of the country because they live at another level. They have other needs, and this problem of these cities. So elite of these metropolises, is quite far from the other people, from other cities. And of course, not all cities will be cosmopolitan. 80% of population will live in the cities, but it does not mean this will be the same, but still layers will be here. And again, there will be a cosmopolitan top. It goes somewhat forward, and it does not understand why it's needed. The rest of the population will not understand, the population which votes. And this is a contradiction, of course, and I can say that Russia does not have it so far, but we are not an exception, and under certain conditions we can face also these processes, and it will be a very serious challenge for big cities. I can say in a nutshell that big cities can have the problem of image, but in another sense, the image of super successful, vibrant, intelligent, well-developed territories of the future. And now this image is positive, but under some conditions it can become negative, because it will be, appalling to people who can't belong to this. And not all people can belong to this, of course. That's why let's come back to this topic. Can global cities substitute states? Recently, in May this year, a lot was written about such data of 400th jubilee of 300 war. This war could be named the First World War, because at that time all policy was around Europe, and practically Europe was at war, so it was the World War. This 30-year war, sorry, not 300, but 30-year war, this war was very bloody and bad, and it put an end to the world where there were no national states. It gave birth, this war gave birth to these national states, and sometimes nothing was organized. And one of the elements why 30-year war was so tough, because there were no regular armies involved. Only gathered, only some people gathered, some groups of people who fulfilled some orders, and then they stopped, and then again, and it was very badly structured. This 30-year war gave the birth to this other world system. The world is structured somehow by national states. I don't want to ruin your mood, but when we say that national states go away, they go away because of some reasons, objective reasons, because this is a different environment. But there will be no substitutions as to structural units of the international systems. And global cities are not for this. They do different things. And that is why I hope that success and development of our cities, and also Forum is also for this, will not give us this situation which we had before this war, 30-year war, when success of others was only caused because other people were robbed.
For that, I think that's actually a really powerful, and I like the point. It gives you a flavor for where the upside and where the downside can come from. So, but can I come back then to the panel with one question before I ask the audience for one question? So how to avoid this dystopian future where we have the potential for contradiction between the interests of the city and the interests of the broader society? And are there ways that we can avoid repeating the past? Are there better mechanisms? Do we have better tools? Or are we facing an unalterable challenge? I'm open. David? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd like to build on what Fyodor just said, which I thought was brilliant, although perhaps I don't agree. But it was extremely insightful. And I think the answer to your question, Jonathan, is we build on what works and build networks of collaboration. I mean, we have a minister here from the Moscow government whose responsibility is partly international relations. I think it's a very powerful statement of how cities see themselves. And yes, there was the 30 Years' War, and yes, we see in our history that having cities have all of the power and states have little power didn't necessarily always work. But this is an evolution in the future. And you can see whether it's in the smart cities concept, intelligent communities that John's working on, or city contributions to the World Economic Forum, or the area I'm involved in climate change, city actions done collaboratively are actually making globalism work and making the nation states impact less relevant. I mean, on climate change, it's shocking that it took national governments 21 years after agreeing on the Kyoto Accord to decide how to act. And even then, the actions in Paris aren't quite good enough. Yet cities, once they decided to act, acted. And I think the trend is going to be towards a bit of a withering of the influence of nations and a much bigger rise in the influence of cities, because they're addressing the real issues that people care about and that we have to address. And we wouldn't have a Department of International Relations. There's a similar department in Chicago and many other cities, New York, in Moscow, if people didn't understand that that need was there. And of course, I'm not predicting that by 2020 all national governments will have disappeared and cities replaced them. It'll be a wonderful thing, but I do think we will see a vastly increasing influence. And the final point I wanted to make is sometimes these relationships can overcome barriers that exist between national governments. So I used to be a member of the board of Metropolis, so it's been mentioned by a couple of people. At that time, the United States of America didn't have relationships with Cuba, but Havana and Los Angeles were on the organization and worked together. So I think we're going to see much more of that and much less of the others. So that's why I disagree a little bit, despite the brilliance of Fyodor's comments.
So I really believe that nation states are going to continue to work with cities. And I'm going to come back to what the previous US administration tried to do in the US State Department, which unfortunately was abolished under this administration. But they sought to set up a cities team. And what did that team do? So first of all, they realized that they didn't know a lot about rapidly emerging cities in various parts of the world. They realized that their embassies weren't necessarily located in those cities. But they also realized that when they were seeking to negotiate agreements that impacted cities, they didn't know cities well enough to be able to negotiate on their behalf. So they sought to get to know cities. And also they sought to get to know the ecosystem that was around cities. So the innovators, smart city technologists, for example, the leading international organizations in the space of cities, the mayoral networks, and to get to know their equivalents in various parts of the world. They also realized that there was this mayor-to-mayor engagement happening across the world, and it's not just discussing, for example, issues like climate, migration, etc., but mayors are often leading trade missions to other cities around the world, and they felt they needed to know what was going on. So I think if you're going to have success, you need to have foreign affairs departments working more closely with cities and sharing policy. But it's not just foreign affairs departments, it's finance ministries, it's infrastructure ministries, because a lot of the funding to actually develop major projects in cities will come from the federal, it will still continue to come from the federal, and a lot of the governance systems and procurement systems that allow them to transform their cities will continue to come from the federal. So there needs to be this closer interaction, and cities need to be empowered by national government if they are, for example, to realize the Paris Agreement, the SDGs and the New Urban Agenda. And in relation to the New Urban Agenda, which was negotiated in Quito in 2016, I thought it was really sad that it was a negotiation around the future of cities and how to realize sustainable cities over the next 20 years. But cities did not have a formal place at the table. So that negotiation happened with member states. Member states who were interested in cities turned up. Member states who were not interested in cities didn't turn up, yet in some instances their mayors were there. And I think that situation needs to dramatically change. So whether formally or informally, I think the likes of the United Nations and the World Bank need to create a place at the table for cities as well.
I'm going to amplify a little bit on what David spoke about. The idea of networks globally, I think, is taking hold. But because technology actually gets rid of borders, there's a need for more agility, there's a need for speed, and a lot of nations aren't able to respond at that level of speed. Communities are. They're much more apt to work very closely together at high speed, high velocity, and are able to communicate and share experiences that are relevant at very close proximity to each other's areas of interest. So I think that intersection is very important. The agility part is very important. And the recognition that these borders are disappearing and are being enabled by technology for the communication is very important. Another thing I think that's very important is that we can't forget that people still need to develop relationships, and they don't do that necessarily with technology. It's enabled by it, but they still need face-to-face relationships, and that's why this networking needs to lead to connectivity beyond just electronic connectivity. They need to connect face-to-face. And that's why these trade missions or these face-to-face support are happening through these kinds of corridors and other kinds of working environments.
I want to save the last word for Minister Cheremin, but so I'm going to come to you now, Fyodor, and say, are you convinced? Does the Ministry of International Affairs and Cities, the cities teams at federal level, the networks of communities, does this give you more confidence that the contradiction between the interests of the city and the interests of the broader polity can be reconciled?
Yes, it's true that cities are already involved with international affairs, and so then they will do it even more. I think it does not contradict what I have said. Moreover, if people are involved more in this international environment, they face it more at fuller volume. And here I mean not only investments, economic activities, flow of people, and this is one of the pressing problems, political even. But when you go to the international arena, cities, even such metropolises as New York, Paris, Moscow, they come into the environment where the main was the problem of war and peace, safety issue in a global sense. And here we can see the trend, which is not so good, the role of military power, and still it increases now in the international relations. And cities have such a choice, quite unpleasant choice, either they can do this themselves, tackle these issues themselves. In this case, metropolises will be huge, fortresses which will try to fight against less developed world, and this will be a disaster, of course. Or it can be work under conditions of the nation state, and it can provide security, safety of all developed, non-developed citizens of the state. It is not a contradiction, but limitations, restrictions are still put from the state.
You to provide the grand synthesis.
Спасибо большое. Арбитром в этой дискуссии.
So I would not like to speak about everything now, but we can see that Moscow government has a lot of powers. We represent the subject of Russian Federation. This is like half state. And as always, the mayor of Moscow says we are responsible for everything, for death and birth of people. We are not, of course, the nation state. We don't want to erase national borders, of course. But the policy of Moscow government is complementary to the policy of Russian Federation. For example, in 2014. Economic sanctions were launched against Russian Federation by Europe, by the USA. And who could suffer first? Of course, Moscow, because Moscow is so important from the economic point of view. Here we have the best enterprises, cutting-edge technologies, and so on. The mayor of Moscow yesterday mentioned that what happened during last 5 years, we never had such a huge growth, transport system developed, disruption of medicine, and also those million of tourists, of fans who came to the World Cup could see with their own eyes that our city is very beautiful, high-tech city, one of the most high-tech cities. And this happened against the national policy of other states. Why did it happen? Because we continue to cooperate with our colleagues from around the world, in Asia, in the USA, also Japan. Since 2014, the relations with our partners, in spite of these problems which we had with sanctions, they were improved, these relations, and we could show with our example that we are not obstacles for foreign business. We welcome foreign business. We give benefits. We are open, transparent, and we develop startups. We continue to cooperate in all sectors without any restrictions. And this changed the attitude not only to Moscow but also to all Russian Federation. So we are changing the perception of Moscow and RF. And of course, with this changing of perception, we can have an impact to national policy. And of course, cities will have an impact. And of course, sometimes nations' borders will be a little bit, expanded. For example, it's like European Union now. It's like the Soviet, country in the past. A lot of countries together. I don't want to discuss here a lot about this topic, but I am sure that diplomacy of cities will have a primary importance. And this globalization, I mean not negative globalization when anti-globalists have a lot of posters, but internalization of economic environment, digital environment, cultural environment cannot be stopped. It's unstoppable, and cities will have a key role here.
Gentlemen, thank you to the panel for what was an interesting and exciting debate. I look forward to a collaborative future between the city and the country.